Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey deep into the heart of ancient Rome, not to marvel at its architectural grandeur or philosophical might, but to unearth the truly grotesque underbelly of one of its most infamous emperors. Imagine yourself wandering through the dimly lit corridors of the imperial palace, the air heavy with the scent of stale wine and something vaguely unsettling. Every shadow seems to writhe with whispered secrets. Every opulent tapestry hides 1,000 untold perversions. You can almost feel the chill of marble beneath your bare feet, a premonition of the cold dread that permeates the very fabric of this era. This isn't your typical Roman holiday. You probably won't survive this tale with your sense of decency entirely intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the year 37 CE, standing on the precipice of a seismic shift in Roman leadership. The ailing Emperor Tiberius, a man known for his reclusive and often cruel nature, is finally, mercifully, drawing his last breath on the island of Capri. Rome holds its breath, a collective sigh of anticipation for what comes next. The whispers in the forum, the hushed conversations in the bathhouses, all point to one name, Gaius, grandson of Germanicus, adopted son of Tiberius. He's young, charismatic, and seems, on the surface at least, to embody all the hopes of a weary populace yearning for a return to stability and prosperity after Tiberius's often oppressive rule. You see him, a figure of striking youth, moving through the mourning crowds. His face, though perhaps a touch too pale, is handsome, framed by dark hair. There's a certain light in his eyes, a spark that some interpret as intelligence and others, with the benefit of hindsight, might call a glint of madness. This is Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but the people know him by a different, more affectionate moniker, Caligula. It's a childhood nickname, given to him by the legionaries in Germany, meaning little boot, a nod to the miniature soldier's boots he wore as a child, while accompanying his revered father Germanicus on campaigns. The name itself seems innocuous, even endearing, a far cry from the monstrous figure he would become. His early life was steeped in both privilege and tragedy, a crucible that perhaps forged the disturbed personality that would later emerge. You remember his father, Germanicus, a military hero, immensely popular with both the legions and the common people. He was seen as the ideal Roman, a man of integrity and courage, but Germanicus died young, under mysterious circumstances, with many suspecting poisoning orchestrated by Tiberius himself. This loss, you imagine, must have cast a long, dark shadow over young Gaius. Then came the brutal purges. You recall how Tiberius, increasingly paranoid, systematically eliminated members of Germanicus's family. Caligula witnessed the arrests, the accusations, the public disgrace, and the ultimate deaths of his mother Agrippina the Elder and his two elder brothers, Nero Caesar and Drusus Caesar. He was still a boy, barely in his teens, forced to live under the watchful, often malevolent eye of Tiberius, who kept him close, perhaps as a twisted form of control, perhaps out of a perverse affection. Historians still argue whether these early traumas were the primary drivers of his later descent into tyranny, or if they merely exacerbated an inherent psychological predisposition. Was he simply a product of his environment, learning cruelty from the very man who held his family's fate in his hands? Or was there an underlying instability, a genetic predisposition that was merely triggered by the horrific events of his youth? You can almost feel the weight of those questions as you watch him now, accepting the accolades of the crowd, the Senate, and the Praetorian Guard. The transition of power is surprisingly smooth. Tiberius's will had named Caligula and his own grandson Tiberius Gemellus as co-heirs, but the Senate, eager to move on from the unpopular Tiberius, quickly set aside Gemellus, declaring Caligula sole emperor. The joy in Rome is palpable. You see bonfires lit in the streets, hear shouts of jubilation echoing through the city. People celebrate for days, sacrificing thousands of animals to the gods in gratitude for the new reign. Gold coins are minted bearing Caligula's image, circulated widely as symbols of a new era. For the first few months he lives up to the hype. He grants large cash gifts to the Praetorian Guard and the common people, fulfilling promises made during his unofficial ascent. He pardons those accused under Tiberius's oppressive treason laws, bringing back exiles and destroying the hated records of their trials. It's a breath of fresh air, a moment of genuine hope. You might even catch yourself smiling, believing for a fleeting moment that perhaps, just perhaps, Rome has found its benevolent ruler. He even dedicates himself to public works, improving the port at Rhegium and restoring temples. He seems attentive to the Senate, respectful of tradition. You think, this isn't so bad after all. But underneath this shining facade, a creeping darkness begins to emerge. It's subtle at first, like a shadow lengthening imperceptibly. You might notice a certain gleam in his eye, a hint of something unsettling in his laughter. He starts to indulge in extravagant spending, not just on necessary public works, but on lavish banquets and personal luxuries that raise a few eyebrows, though no one dares to speak out. The generosity, initially seen as a virtue, starts to look more like a desperate need for applause, a frantic attempt to buy affection. One peculiar habit you might observe is his intense interest in the gladiatorial games and chariot races, not just as a spectator, but with a bizarre, almost obsessive focus on the participants. He starts to spend long nights in the stables, fraternizing with charioteers and gladiators, sometimes even sleeping there. It's an unusual preoccupation for an emperor, a departure from the dignified distance expected of a Roman leader. You might hear whispers among the old families, murmurs of disapproval about his unseemly closeness to these performers, who, while popular, were considered to be on the fringes of Roman society. It's a minor quirk, you tell yourself, harmless enough. Just a young man enjoying the thrills of the arena. Yet this fascination reveals a deeper, more unsettling characteristic. A disregard for the established social order, and a burgeoning desire to control and manipulate those around him. He isn't just watching, he's immersing himself, learning the language of power and spectacle, a language he would soon twist to his own horrifying ends. He begins to assert his will in petty ways, dismissing advisers who offer even the mildest dissent, favouring sycophants who echo his every whim. The initial warmth he exuded begins to curdle into something colder, more demanding. You start to feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere around him, from one of hopeful expectation to one of cautious apprehension. The smiles of the courtiers become a little more forced, the bows a little deeper, laced with an unspoken fear. The initial euphoria of Caligula's reign, that brief shining moment of hope, begins to dissolve like mist in the Roman sun. You notice the subtle shifts first, the small cracks in the polished facade that hint at a deeper, more troubling instability. It's like watching a beautifully crafted vase slowly develop hairline fractures. You know, instinctively, that it's only a matter of time before it shatters completely. His lavish spending, initially perceived as imperial generosity, spirals into reckless extravagance. He begins to demand ever more audacious spectacles, draining the treasury at an alarming rate. You might hear tales of his custom-built ships, adorned with jewels and exotic gardens, complete with dining halls and even baths. Imagine the logistical nightmare, the sheer cost of maintaining such floating palaces on Lake Nemi, all for his personal amusement. These aren't just displays of wealth, they're acts of defiance against financial prudence, a clear signal that the rules of the old world no longer apply to him. Then there's the matter of his health. A severe illness strikes him a few months into his rule, a mysterious affliction that leaves him gravely ill. For weeks, Rome is gripped by anxiety, praying for his recovery. Temples are filled with desperate citizens making vows, offering sacrifices, even promising their own lives if the gods would only spare their young emperor. You remember the genuine outpouring of grief and fear across the city during that time. But when he finally recovers, there's a palpable shift. The man who emerges from the sickbed is not quite the same. Some whisper that the illness affected his mind, leaving him changed, perhaps even unhinged. Historians still argue whether this illness truly triggered his madness, or merely unveiled a latent psychological disorder. Was it a high fever that damaged his brain? Or did the brush with death simply remove whatever inhibitions he once possessed, unleashing a monstrous ego that had always been lurking beneath the surface? Whatever the cause, the change is undeniable. His charm, which had once captivated the masses, takes on a sinister edge. His humour morphs into biting sarcasm and outright cruelty. The gentle irony you might have detected earlier gives way to a sardonic wit that leaves those around him terrified. You experience this firsthand when he begins to hold conversations with Jupiter Capitolinus, the supreme god of Rome, not in the privacy of a temple, but in full public view. He constructs a bridge from his palace to the temple of Jupiter, claiming it allowed him to commune more directly with the deity. You watch, bewildered, as he engages in heated arguments with the statue of Jupiter, sometimes even whispering obscenities or challenging the god to a wrestling match. At other times, he claims Jupiter is seeking his counsel, humbling himself before Caligula's divine wisdom. It's a spectacle both absurd and terrifying, a public display of delusions of grandeur that sends a shiver down your spine. His treatment of the Senate, initially respectful, devolves into open contempt. You sit in the Senate House feeling the tension, the palpable fear as he enters. He no longer bothers with polite formalities. He ridicules senators openly, mocks their age, their appearance, their intelligence. He demands obsequious flattery, punishing the slightest perceived slight with public humiliation or worse. You recall the chilling story of how he forced a senator who had vowed his own life for Caligula's recovery to commit suicide simply because the senator had dared to make such a public promise. "A vow is a vow," he would declare with a chilling smile, leaving no room for retraction. "This isn't just about power, it's about breaking men, asserting absolute dominance through fear and psychological torment." His private life, too, becomes a subject of whispered horror. You become aware of his increasingly disturbing relationship with his three sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Drusilla, and Livilla. While displaying affection for one's family was common, Caligula's devotion to his sisters, particularly Drusilla, crossed all boundaries of Roman propriety. He openly treated Drusilla as if she were his wife, elevating her above his actual consort, even declaring her a goddess after her death. You witness their public displays of affection, shocking to even the most jaded Roman, as they walk hand in hand, perhaps even engaging in more intimate gestures in full view of the court. Historians still debate the true extent of their physical relationship, with some ancient sources claiming outright incest, while others suggest it was more a perverse display of power and a deliberate flouting of social norms. What is undeniable is the extreme favoritism and intimacy he showed, using his sisters as pawns in his power games and as extensions of his own twisted desires. You might even remember that bizarre incident with his favourite racehorse, Incitatus. This wasn't just a pet. This horse was treated with more deference than many senators. Incitatus had a marble stall, an ivory manger, purple blankets, and a jewelled bridle. He even had his own house, complete with servants. Caligula would invite guests to dine with Incitatus, demanding they treat the horse with the utmost respect. This wasn't just eccentric behaviour, it was a deliberate, calculated insult to the Roman elite. It was his way of saying, "I can do anything I want, even make a horse a consul, and you will all bow down to it." It was a demonstration of his absolute power, a grotesque parody of traditional Roman values. The idea of a horse becoming a consul, a position of immense political power and prestige, was so utterly ludicrous that it served to highlight Caligula's utter contempt for the institutions of Rome. It wasn't just a joke, it was a dagger aimed at the heart of the Republic's legacy, a mockery of the very foundations upon which Roman society was built. And then there's the growing fascination with violence. You see him attend the gladiatorial games with an intensity that verges on manic. He doesn't just enjoy the bloodshed, he orchestrates it, sometimes demanding more and more brutal contests. He reportedly had a perverse delight in watching the condemned meet their end, occasionally even throwing members of the audience or his own courtiers into the arena to be torn apart by beasts, simply for his amusement or to thin out the crowd. It's a terrifying escalation from casual viewing to active participation in sadism. You feel a creeping dread as you witness these spectacles, a growing certainty that this man is not merely eccentric or troubled, but truly dangerous. He begins to implement bizarre and cruel taxes, not out of necessity, but seemingly out of sheer caprice. You hear of taxes on prostitutes, on lawsuits, even on human waste. These are not only financially burdensome but deeply insulting, designed to underscore his absolute authority and the populace's utter subjugation. The initial adulation that greeted his ascension has now curdled into a mix of fear, resentment, and a desperate, whispered hope for his demise. The honeymoon is definitively over. The monster, it seems, has fully awoken. You can almost feel the collective holding of breath across Rome. everyone waiting, dreading what new abomination he will unleash next. The carefree spirit that once permeated the Roman air has been replaced by a heavy, suffocating blanket of terror. You find yourself walking the streets with a new kind of awareness, a heightened sense of vigilance, constantly on edge, wondering if you too might become the subject of the emperor's next whim. As Caligula's reign progresses, you find yourself increasingly immersed in a waking nightmare, a twisted reality where the conventional norms of Roman society are not merely bent, but utterly shattered. The polite fictions of imperial rule, the pretense of a benevolent leader guided by senatorial wisdom, are stripped away to reveal the raw, unadulterated power of a man utterly consumed by his own depravity. The unsettling whispers about his sisters that began in hushed tones now echo openly in the Roman elite's gilded halls. You recall how Roman emperors often used their female relatives for political alliances through marriage, a transactional reality of power. But Caligula's relationship with his sisters, particularly Drusilla, defied all precedent, all decency. You observe him openly holding hands with Drusilla in public, a gesture of intimacy usually reserved for married couples, not siblings. You see them at banquets, sitting together in positions of prominence, their closeness almost aggressively displayed. He would openly declare her his wife, even while maintaining a string of other marital alliances purely for political optics. He would kiss her openly, caress her in front of courtiers and guests, all while daring anyone to object with the subtle, terrifying threat in his eyes. Imagine the discomfort, the horror, among the Roman aristocracy, who prided themselves on their rigid social structures and moral codes. This wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was a fundamental assault on the very concept of the Roman family, the bedrock of their society. After Drusilla's premature death, you witness the extent of his perverse devotion. He decrees a period of public mourning, unlike anything seen for a private citizen, even a member of the imperial family. Rome grinds to a halt. All entertainment is forbidden, and anyone caught celebrating or even smiling too broadly is subject to severe punishment. He elevates her to the status of a goddess, Diva Drusilla, a living embodiment of the divine Augustus's imperial cult, demanding that she be worshipped alongside the traditional Roman pantheon. You see statues erected in her honour, temples dedicated to her memory. It's an unprecedented act, a posthumous deification that further blurs the lines between mortal and divine, all to satisfy his twisted fixation. Historians still argue whether his incestuous relationships were rooted in a genuine, pathological lust, or primarily a calculated, perverse display of ultimate power, a way to show that he was above all laws, even those of nature and morality. Perhaps it was a combination of both, a disturbed mind finding an outlet for its desires while simultaneously revelling in the shock and terror it inflicted. Regardless, you understand that these public displays served as a powerful tool of intimidation. If he could violate the most sacred of family taboos with impunity, what restraint could possibly hold him back from any other atrocity? His other sisters, Agrippina the Younger and Livilla, also fall victim to his volatile affections and manipulations. While their relationship with him might not have been as overtly incestuous as with Drusilla, they were still used, abused, and later discarded. You see them elevated, given immense influence at court, only to be cast down in disgrace on a whim, accused of treason or conspiracy, and then exiled. Agrippina, for instance, would later return to play a significant role in the reigns of Claudius and Nero, but under Caligula her life was a constant dance on the edge of a precipice, dictated by her brother's capricious moods. You watch as they navigate this perilous existence, forced to endure his erratic behaviour, knowing that their very lives hang by the thinnest of threads. The atmosphere in the imperial palace becomes suffocating, a constant state of anxiety. You might attend one of Caligula's infamous banquets, a spectacle of excess and perverse entertainment. The food is unbelievably rich, the wine flows freely, but the conversation is strained. Every guest is on edge, scrutinising Caligula's expressions, trying to anticipate his next unpredictable move. He might tell a crude joke, then stare intensely at one of the guests, waiting for a reaction. Laugh too much, and you might be seen as mocking him. Laugh too little, and you might be deemed disloyal. It's a terrifying tightrope walk. You recall one such evening, a seemingly jovial gathering that suddenly turns chilling. Caligula, in a fit of pique, gestures to two prominent senators seated opposite him, remarking casually, "At a single nod from me, both of you could have your throats cut." The senators freeze, their forced smiles faltering, the blood draining from their faces. Caligula merely laughs, a harsh, unfeeling sound, delighted by their terror. It's not just a threat, it's a demonstration of absolute power, a brutal reminder that their lives are entirely at his mercy, no matter their status or influence. This wasn't an isolated incident. These casual declarations of lethal intent became a terrifying hallmark of his rule. You'd constantly feel that knot in your stomach, wondering if you would be next, if your name would be the next one whispered with a casual flick of his wrist. He also develops a particular fondness for gaming with human lives. You might hear tales, perhaps even witness, how he would force parents to witness the execution of their children, or husbands their wives, purely for his amusement. He would orchestrate mock battles not with gladiators, but with prominent citizens, forcing them into combat with each other or with wild animals, stripping them of their dignity before their lives. The Roman concept of dignitas, of personal honour and standing, was meticulously cultivated, and Caligula systematically sought to dismantle it in everyone around him, leaving them utterly humiliated and broken. This public display of incest and his arbitrary cruelty serve a dual purpose in his increasingly deranged mind. Firstly, they satisfy his personal, pathological desires, whatever their root. Secondly, and perhaps more significantly for the political landscape, they are powerful instruments of control. By violating the deepest taboos and demonstrating such extreme, capricious power, he systematically dismantles any remaining moral authority or social structure that might challenge him. He forces the Roman elite to become complicit in his depravities, to witness them, to endure them, and thereby to implicitly accept them. He strips them of their integrity, leaving them with nothing but fear. The constant tension, the fear of his next unpredictable outburst transforms daily life in Rome. You find people walking with their eyes downcast, speaking in hushed tones, carefully choosing their words even in private. The joyous atmosphere that marked his ascension has been replaced by a pervasive sense of dread. Every rumour, every slight oddity is amplified and twisted by the pervasive fear. You hear whispers of his strange nocturnal habits, of him wandering the palace alone, talking to the moon, or engaging in bizarre rituals. These anecdotes, whether true or exaggerated, only serve to further solidify his image as a madman, a ruler whose sanity is as fragile as a spider's web. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, that bizarre concoction you heard about from some far-off land? Well, the Roman elite now finds themselves in a position where they'd probably be willing to try anything to avoid Caligula's gaze, even smeared in the foulest substances. Their lives are no longer their own. They are mere props in his grotesque theatrical production. The opulence of the imperial court becomes a gilded cage, trapping those within its walls in a terrifying dance with madness. The true horror isn't just the acts themselves, but the systematic erosion of human dignity and the utter helplessness of those caught in his orbit. Having witnessed the shocking depths of Caligula's personal depravity and his contempt for established Roman morality, you now turn your attention to a more tangible manifestation of his increasingly unhinged mind. His grand, utterly irrational building projects. These aren't just acts of imperial patronage, they are monuments to megalomania, exercises in colossal waste that further solidify his image as a ruler unbound by reason or responsibility. You stand now in your mind's eye on the shores of Baiae, a luxurious resort town on the Bay of Naples, renowned for its thermal baths and opulent villas. Here, Caligula embarks on what is perhaps his most infamous and baffling construction, a floating bridge across the entire Bay of Naples. Imagine the sheer audacity of it. The bay is vast, several miles wide and renowned for its deep waters. To bridge it would be an engineering marvel of unprecedented scale, even for the Romans, masters of aqueducts and roads. But Caligula's motivation isn't practical. It's a whim, a defiance of a prophecy. You recall the ancient oracle that supposedly declared he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. Or perhaps, some whispers suggest, it was a display of power for a visiting Parthian king, a demonstration that Rome's emperor could command nature itself. Whatever the true impetus, the project is a testament to his boundless ego and utter disregard for common sense. you watch as vast numbers of merchant ships commandeered from across the Mediterranean are lined up in 2 rows side by side, forming the foundation of this monstrous causeway. These aren't just any ships. These are vital vessels for transporting grain, wine, and goods, their diversion immediately causing disruptions in trade and supply lines across the empire. Timber planks are laid across their decks, creating a makeshift road. Entire legions of labourers, both soldiers and slaves, toil endlessly, their efforts fueled by fear of the emperor's wrath. The sounds of hammering, shouting and groaning fill the air, a cacophony of enforced industry. For 2 days and nights, Caligula parades across this colossal, precarious bridge. He's not simply walking, he's riding his favourite horse, Incitatus, dressed in the armour of Alexander the Great. He hosts banquets on the bridge, inviting the Roman elite to dine with him in the middle of the bay, under the watchful eyes of the stars. The wine flows, the music plays, but you sense the pervasive unease beneath the forced merriment. Everyone is aware of the immense cost, the logistical nightmare, and the sheer pointlessness of it all. It's a spectacle of consumption, a performance designed to prove his absolute dominion, not just over people, but over the very elements. Historians still argue whether this bridge was actually used for anything beyond this singular, grandiose display, or if it was immediately dismantled afterward. Some accounts suggest it remained for a short period, a temporary structure, while others indicate it was pulled apart almost as soon as the celebrations ended. Regardless, the economic damage is immediate and profound. The diversion of ships, the massive expenditure of resources, the disruption of trade, all contribute to a rapidly depleting treasury and growing shortages in Rome. You start to see the ripple effects. Prices for essential goods rise, and murmurs of discontent begin to spread among the populace, who had initially celebrated his arrival. Beyond the Bay of Naples, Caligula embarks on other equally absurd and ruinous projects. You hear of his plans for a massive artificial lake in the Vatican Valley, purely for mock naval battles. Imagine the manpower, the engineering, the sheer amount of earth that would need to be moved for such an endeavour, all for a fleeting spectacle. He orders the construction of new palaces, not out of necessity, but to outdo the opulence of previous emperors. He demands ever more luxurious villas for himself, adorned with precious stones and exotic materials, seemingly oblivious to the financial strain his whims are placing on the empire. One quirky tidbit you might learn is his obsession with moving ancient Egyptian obelisks. One particularly massive obelisk, dedicated to the sun god Ra, which now stands in St. Peter's Square in Vatican City, was brought from Egypt under Caligula's orders. The engineering feat involved in transporting such a colossal stone across the sea and then erecting it in Rome was immense, requiring a specially built ship and immense resources. This wasn't for religious devotion or public utility. It was another demonstration of his ability to command unimaginable resources, to literally move mountains, or at least monumental stones, at his will. It's an impressive feat, no doubt, but one that highlights his disproportionate focus on grand, often useless, gestures rather than the practicalities of governing an empire. You feel the weight of these projects, not just in terms of stone and gold, but in the human cost. The labourers, many of them slaves or soldiers, are pushed to their limits, facing harsh conditions and the constant threat of imperial displeasure. Their lives are expendable in the face of his boundless ambition. The vast sums of money poured into these follies could have been used for essential infrastructure, for supporting the legions, or for aiding the common people. Instead, they vanish into these fleeting, self-aggrandizing displays. The Roman economy, initially robust, begins to buckle under this relentless assault. The systematic squandering of funds, coupled with his increasingly bizarre and arbitrary taxes, creates a sense of economic instability. You recall the initial relief at his generosity, the widespread distribution of money to the people and the Praetorian Guard. That money is now rapidly being clawed back, and more, through unprecedented levies on almost everything imaginable. He taxes even the most basic transactions, the very fabric of daily life. This isn't just about raising revenue, it's about asserting absolute control, demonstrating that every aspect of Roman life, no matter how small, is subject to his will. The Grand Bridge across the Bay of Naples, perhaps more than any other project, symbolises the full extent of Caligula's destructive reign. It's a physical manifestation of his disregard for boundaries, for logic, and for the well-being of his empire. It's a bridge to nowhere, literally and figuratively, leading only to further madness and ruin. As you reflect on this, you realize that the external grandeur he sought to project was nothing more than a thin veil over an increasingly chaotic and dysfunctional reality. The empire isn't just being ruled, it's being plundered by its own emperor, sacrificed on the altar of his boundless ego. You begin to understand that these aren't just habits, they are systemic acts of imperial self-destruction. Having witnessed the monumental waste of his architectural follies, your attention is now drawn to the most unsettling and defining aspect of Caligula's deteriorating sanity, his increasingly fervent belief in his own divinity. This isn't a subtle imperial cult, an abstract veneration of the emperor as a god after death, as Augustus had cautiously introduced. No, this is Caligula demanding immediate, tangible worship from his subjects, equating himself with the most revered deities of the Roman pantheon, and mocking anyone who dared to suggest otherwise. You recall how previous emperors, like Augustus and Tiberius, had been wary of embracing divine honours while alive, understanding that such claims could easily incite resentment or ridicule. They preferred to cultivate a cult of personality that hinted at divine favour rather than outright godhood. Caligula, however, throws all such caution to the winds. He doesn't merely suggest he's divine, he proclaims it, demands it, and brutally enforces it. You see him, dressed in the elaborate robes and carrying the attributes of various gods. Sometimes he appears as Jupiter, complete with a thunderbolt and a golden beard. Other times he's Neptune, wielding a trident. You might even witness him as Mercury, with winged sandals and a caduceus, or even as Venus or Diana, embracing the full spectrum of divine identities regardless of gender. Imagine the sheer theatricality of it, the grotesque spectacle of your emperor parading around in drag, demanding veneration as a goddess. It's a level of narcissism and delusion that beggars belief. He constructs a temple dedicated to himself on the Palatine Hill, a grand edifice staffed by priests and complete with sacrificial animals. He appoints the wealthiest and most prominent citizens to serve as his priests, forcing them to spend vast sums of their own money on rituals and offerings to his divine self. You might see senators, trembling with fear and humiliation, offering sacrifices to a statue of Caligula that stands proudly in the temple, its features designed to resemble his own. This isn't voluntary devotion, it's coerced blasphemy. One particularly chilling scene involves his conversations with Jupiter Capitolinus, which become even more frequent and intense. You remember the bridge he built to the temple? Now he regularly spends hours there, not merely communing, but openly arguing with the statue of Jupiter. He would rage, he would plead, he would threaten. Either raise me to heaven, or I will cast you down to Tartarus, he would reportedly shout at the heavens, an utterly deluded challenge to the king of the gods himself. At times, he would even mimic Jupiter's thunder and lightning, demanding that his own thunderbolts be made more potent than those of the traditional god. This wasn't just eccentric, it was a profound psychological break, a complete abandonment of reality. Historians still argue whether this self-deification was a genuine symptom of madness, or a calculated political maneuver to consolidate absolute power by making himself unchallengeable. Was it schizophrenia, megalomania, or a perverse strategy? Perhaps a terrifying fusion of all three, where a deeply disturbed mind found the perfect excuse to wield unchecked power. What is clear is that this insistence on his divinity served to alienate the Roman elite even further, forcing them to debase themselves in ways that violated their deepest traditions and sense of honour. The Jewish community, particularly, found themselves in a perilous position. Monotheistic, they refused to worship the emperor as a god. You hear tales of their resistance, their pleas to him to respect their religious freedom. Caligula, however, saw their refusal as an act of defiance, a challenge to his authority. He ordered his statue to be placed in the Temple of Jerusalem, a deliberate provocation that threatened to ignite a massive rebellion in Judea. You can almost feel the tension, the fear of widespread conflict that this edict caused, only averted by his eventual assassination and the intervention of his successor, Claudius. This conflict highlights his total disregard for religious pluralism and his unwavering belief that his divine will superseded all other beliefs. His mockery of traditional Roman religion wasn't limited to challenging Jupiter. You might see him parading through the streets with a retinue of priests dressed in bizarre, outlandish costumes, performing absurd rituals that ridiculed long-held sacred practices. He would invite guests to banquets, where he would openly mock the gods, telling crude jokes about them, or performing lewd acts in their supposed honour. This wasn't just sacrilege, it was a deliberate attempt to dismantle the spiritual foundations of Roman society, to show that all authority, even divine, flowed solely from him. One quirky detail that illustrates his bizarre relationship with the divine is his interaction with the god Apollo. Caligula believed he was Apollo incarnate, and would frequently appear in public playing the lyre, even though he was apparently a terrible musician. Imagine the excruciating experience of having to sit through a performance by your emperor, knowing that applauding too little might mean your head, but applauding too much might be seen as ironic. You'd have to master the art of the perfect neutral applause, an act of sheer diplomatic genius just to survive the evening. The chilling aspect of his divine delusions is not just the spectacle, but the justification it provided for his increasingly arbitrary and cruel actions. If he was a god, then he was beyond human laws, beyond moral judgment. Any act, no matter how heinous, could be excused as the divine will. This absolute self-belief freed him from any accountability, transforming him into a living, breathing instrument of chaos. You feel the profound injustice of it all, the terrifying realization that reason and justice have completely abandoned the imperial throne. The empire is no longer guided by laws or traditions, but by the capricious whims of a man who believes himself to be above all mortals, a divine tyrant. With Caligula's divine delusions firmly established, you now observe how this self-proclaimed god extends his sadistic reach into the very heart of Roman entertainment, the gladiatorial games. These spectacles, once brutal but regulated, become a terrifying extension of his personal whims, a bloody stage for his insatiable craving for cruelty and absolute control. You might think you've seen it all in the Roman arena, the roar of the crowd, the clash of steel, the desperate struggle of man against man or beast. But under Caligula, the games descend into a new, unprecedented level of depravity. Normally, gladiatorial contests followed a certain protocol. There were rules, renowned champions, and a general understanding that the emperor, while powerful, presided over an established tradition. Caligula, however, throws all decorum to the winds. His thirst for blood isn't just for entertainment. It's a personal, almost intimate engagement with suffering. He would often arrive late or leave early, just to assert his indifference, only to return with a sudden manic energy, demanding new, unscheduled bouts. You stand in the vast Colosseum, or perhaps the smaller amphitheatre on the Campus Martius, the air thick with the smell of sweat, blood and fear. The crowds, initially boisterous, often grow quiet, their cheers turning into nervous murmurs, as Caligula's mood dictates the flow of the games. You see him lean forward, his eyes gleaming with a disturbing intensity, sometimes even shouting instructions directly to the gladiators or their trainers. He wasn't just a spectator. He was the director of death, relishing every drop of blood. One chilling practice you might witness is his habit of ordering unexpected executions. If a gladiator fought poorly, or if the crowd displeased him, or simply if he was bored, he would signal for arbitrary deaths. He might order gladiators who had already fought bravely and earned a reprieve to be killed anyway. You remember the accepted traditions of the polis verso, the thumb gesture that indicated life or death. Under Caligula, that tradition became a macabre joke, entirely subject to his whim, regardless of the gladiator's performance. Sometimes he would send in unexpected combatants. Imagine the terror when, instead of trained gladiators, you see elderly men, cripples, or even innocent spectators dragged into the arena to face armed combatants or wild animals. This wasn't justice or punishment. It was pure, unadulterated sadism, designed to shock and terrify both the victims and the audience. You might hear the screams, feel the collective gasp of horror from the crowd, quickly stifled by the pervasive fear of becoming the next victim. He delighted in the sheer unpredictability of it, the way it shattered the illusion of safety, even for those in the stands. His passion for chariots, already noted, intensifies. He would spend vast sums on his favourite charioteers, showering them with gifts and favours. He even reportedly planned to race in the Circus Maximus himself, dressed in the livery of a charioteer, a further degradation of the imperial dignity. He would punish rival teams' supporters, sometimes with public floggings or even death, if they cheered too loudly against his chosen faction. It was a bizarre blend of childish favouritism and brutal authoritarianism. Historians still argue about the true extent of his direct participation in these acts of violence. Were the most extreme accounts exaggerated by later hostile sources, or was he genuinely as monstrous as described? While precise numbers might be debated, the consistent theme across multiple ancient writers points to an emperor who found profound personal satisfaction in orchestrated suffering. This isn't just cruelty, it's a pathological enjoyment of pain and humiliation. You might recall that mainstream historical fact about the public funding of games, how they were used to keep the populace content, a bread and circuses strategy. Caligula twists this on its head. While he still provides the games, their true purpose shifts from appeasement to terror. The games become a constant reminder of his absolute capricious power, a demonstration that no one, not even the revered gladiators or the adoring crowds, is safe from his whims. One quirky tidbit about his arena conduct is his habit of ordering all the nets in the arena to be removed during wild beast hunts. These nets were usually there to protect the audience from escaping animals. Caligula would remove them, forcing the spectators to cower in their seats, clutching their togas, as lions and bears ran wild dangerously close to the stands. It was a bizarre, almost childish prank, but one with genuinely terrifying implications, designed purely for his amusement, and to amplify the sense of danger and vulnerability. You'd feel your heart pound in your chest, your muscles tensed, ready to bolt, even if you knew there was nowhere to go. The cruelty wasn't limited to the arena. You hear whispers of tortures in the palace, of people being slowly mutilated or subjected to psychological torment before their eventual deaths, often for the slightest perceived insult, or simply because Caligula was bored. He reportedly enjoyed watching condemned men being slowly sawn in half, or having their tongues cut out before being fed to wild animals. While such gruesome details are often embellished in ancient texts, the underlying truth points to a ruler who was profoundly disturbed, whose enjoyment of suffering went far beyond the typical Roman acceptance of violence. The Roman people, who had initially embraced him with such fervour, now live in a constant state of apprehension. The joyous shouts that once welcomed him now sound hollow, forced, laced with fear. The gladiatorial games, once a source of communal excitement, become a grim pageant of arbitrary death, a living demonstration of the emperor's absolute power over life and limb. You walk away from the arena with a heavy heart, the image of suffering burned into your mind, knowing that the entertainment has ceased to be about valour or skill, and has instead become a horrifying testament to one man's descent into utter madness. The roar of the crowd, once a sound of exhilaration, now sounds like a collective moan of despair. As Caligula's reign of terror continues, you observe a particularly insidious aspect of his rule, his systematic humiliation of Rome's elite. This wasn't merely collateral damage from a madman's whims, it was a deliberate, calculated strategy to break the spirit of the Senate and the wealthy, influential citizens, reinforcing his absolute dominance. Imagine the scene. These are men, and some women, who embody the very fabric of Roman society. Patricians with ancient lineages, esteemed military commanders, brilliant jurists and powerful financiers. Their dignitas, their personal honour and prestige, is their most prized possession, the very essence of their social standing, and Caligula delights in stripping them of it, piece by agonising piece. You sit in the Senate House, a grand and imposing space, where debates once shaped the fate of an empire. Now it feels more like a theatrical stage for Caligula's cruel dramas. He enters, not with the stately bearing of an emperor-seeking council, but with a swagger, often dressed in outlandish attire that mocks traditional Roman garb. Perhaps he wears a military breastplate adorned with jewels, or a silk toga woven with effeminate patterns, deliberately provoking the sensibilities of the conservative senators. He would interrupt their speeches not with reasoned arguments, but with crude jokes or biting sarcasm. He would call them out by name, often with demeaning nicknames, and publicly ridicule their appearance, their age, or their supposed lack of courage. You might see a distinguished senator, a man who has served the Republic for decades, forced to endure Caligula's taunts about his baldness, or his potbelly, his face flushing with humiliation, while he desperately tries to maintain composure. The unspoken rule is clear. Any reaction, even a flicker of defiance, could lead to far worse consequences. One particularly galling tactic he employed was forcing senators to run alongside his chariot as he entered the city, treating them like common slaves or animals. Imagine the indignity. A man of consular rank, accustomed to being carried in a litter or riding proudly, now forced to pant and sweat through the dusty streets, trying to keep pace with the emperor's fast-moving vehicle, all while the common folk, once respectful, now stare or even snicker. This wasn't about speed, it was about demonstrating who held the leash. He would also demand that senators perform menial tasks utterly beneath their station. You might hear tales of him forcing them to serve him at banquets, like common waiters, or to run errands like personal attendants. One infamous account speaks of him forcing senators to literally hold up his toga for hours on end, their arms aching, while he held court, completely oblivious to their discomfort. It was a deliberate act of infantilization, designed to strip them of their professional and personal pride. His banquets, which we've touched upon, become open arenas for this public degradation. He might force eminent Roman matrons, wives of senators and prominent figures to act as waitresses, or even to pose in indecent ways. You can almost feel the collective horror and shame of the families present, forced to witness such depravities, knowing that their honour and their lives depended on their silent complicity. He reportedly would make comments about their wives and daughters in public, openly suggesting sexual liaisons, thereby desecrating the most sacred bonds of Roman society. Historians still debate the psychological motivations behind this relentless assault on the elite. Was it simple sadism? A deep-seated resentment against the class that had once controlled his destiny? Or a cynical understanding that by breaking the powerful, he simultaneously broke the back of any organised resistance? Perhaps it was a combination of all three, fueled by his increasing paranoia. What is certain is that these acts served to terrorise the very people who traditionally held the most power to depose an emperor. A quirky detail illustrating his contempt for the Senate is the story of him addressing them one day, then suddenly bursting into uncontrollable laughter. When asked by confused senators what was so amusing, he replied, "Just thinking that with a single nod I could have all your throats cut." This wasn't a joke meant to entertain, it was a chilling declaration of intent, a reminder that their lives were entirely contingent on his arbitrary will. The response from the senators would have been a forced, nervous chuckle, followed by a profound, paralysing silence. You would feel the cold knot of fear in your stomach, a chilling reminder of your own vulnerability. His insults often extended to the most fundamental aspects of Roman identity. He would frequently praise non-Roman customs, particularly those of Eastern despots, directly contrasting them with venerable Roman traditions just to spite the senators. He might wear barbarian costumes, encourage foreign rituals, or openly mock the revered institutions of the Republic, such as the elections or the ancient religious practices. This wasn't just bad taste, it was an active rejection of everything the Roman elite held sacred, a deliberate attempt to dismantle their cultural identity. The result of this systematic humiliation was profound. The Senate, once a powerful body that advised emperors and theoretically held significant sway, became utterly impotent. Their dignity shattered, their members cowed by fear, they ceased to be a check on imperial power, and instead became mere instruments of Caligula's tyranny. You see them nod in agreement to his most outrageous demands, their eyes empty, their spirits broken. This is perhaps one of his most destructive habits, not in terms of grand spectacles, but in its corrosive effect on the very institutions of the state. He didn't just rule Rome, he owned it, and everyone in it, especially those who thought they were his equals. The air in Rome, once filled with the bustling energy of a thriving metropolis, now carries a pervasive undercurrent of anxiety. Even the most powerful citizens walk with caution, constantly aware of the invisible boundaries that could be crossed, the slightest misstep that could lead to public disgrace or worse. The memory of Caligula's snickering laughter, his chilling pronouncements would echo in your mind, a constant reminder of the fragile nature of life and status under his deranged rule. You realise that sometimes the most painful wounds are not physical, but those inflicted on the soul through relentless, systematic humiliation. After witnessing the deliberate debasement of Rome's esteemed senators, your thoughts turn to one of Caligula's most utterly bizarre and symbolically potent acts of mockery, the elevation of his horse, Incitatus, to a position of unprecedented honour, even hinting at a consulship. This isn't just a quirky tidbit. It's a profound, chilling statement on Caligula's contempt for Roman institutions a middle finger aimed squarely at the very concept of governance and the dignity of the elite. You remember Incitatus from earlier, the emperor's favourite racehorse, a champion of the Greens faction in the Circus Maximus. But Caligula's affection for this animal transcends typical pet ownership. It morphs into an obsession, a grotesque parody of imperial favouritism. You hear the whispers, then see the evidence, of the lavish life Incitatus leads. He has his own marble stable, polished to a gleam, a literal palace for a horse. His manger isn't rough-hewn wood, but intricately carved ivory, likely imported at immense cost. His blankets are not simple wool, but dyed purple, the colour of imperial royalty, and adorned with precious jewels. He's served wine in a golden pail, not just water, a luxury usually reserved for the most distinguished human guests. Imagine the servants assigned to Incitatus, not just stable hands, but seemingly entire retinue of attendants, devoted solely to his comfort and well-being. He even has his own house, fully furnished, complete with furniture, where guests would allegedly be invited to dine with the horse. You can almost picture the awkward dinner parties, the forced smiles, as senators and their wives try to make polite conversation with a horse, all while Caligula watches, a smirk playing on his lips, relishing their discomfort. This wasn't about loving an animal, it was about asserting his power to elevate the mundane, the non-human, above the most venerable members of Roman society. The ultimate affront, and the one that truly highlighted Caligula's disdain for the Roman system, was his repeated threats, or perhaps genuine intentions to appoint Incitatus as a consul. The consulship was the highest elected office in the Roman Republic, a position of immense prestige and authority, traditionally held by the most experienced and respected senators. To even suggest that a horse could hold such a position was an insult of epic proportions, a deliberate debasement of everything Rome held sacred. You can almost hear the collective gasp of horror from the Senate, quickly stifled, of course, lest they incur the emperor's wrath. Historians still argue whether Caligula genuinely intended to make Incitatus consul, or if it was merely a cruel joke, a means of taunting the Senate. Some sources suggest he was in the process of formalising the appointment before his assassination. Regardless of the ultimate outcome, the very idea, publicly floated and seemingly seriously considered, was enough to send a clear message. The traditional institutions of Rome were meaningless, a joke to be played with at the emperor's leisure. The horse, being a mute and unthinking creature, would obviously offer no dissent, no advice, no challenge to Caligula's absolute rule. It was the perfect subservient official, a potent symbol of how little he valued the intelligence or counsel of his human subjects. This quirky tidbit, the story of Incitatus, often gets recounted as a funny, almost charming example of Caligula's eccentricity. But for the Romans who lived through it, it was terrifying. It symbolised the complete breakdown of order, the inversion of all established hierarchies. If a horse could be a consul, then what was the point of striving for political office, of dedicating your life to public service, of upholding the gravitas of Roman tradition? It rendered all their efforts, all their ambitions utterly meaningless. It was a psychological weapon, a powerful reminder that their entire world could be upended on a whim. You reflect on the mainstream historical fact that Roman emperors, even the most tyrannical, usually paid at least lip service to the institutions of the Republic. They understood the importance of maintaining appearances, of going through the motions of senatorial consultations and elections, even if the real power lay elsewhere. Caligula, however, openly scoffed at this. His actions with Incitatus were a direct public rejection of this unspoken contract. He wanted everyone to know that he ruled not by tradition or consensus, but by pure, unadulterated force of will. The symbolic weight of Incitatus's elevation was immense. It wasn't just about a horse, it was about the utter humiliation of the Roman elite. Imagine being a senator, a man of noble birth, sitting in the curia, knowing that your emperor thought a horse was as capable, or perhaps even more capable than you were. The constant pressure, the pervasive fear, meant that even if you wanted to protest, you couldn't. You had to feign approval, or at least polite indifference to such an outrageous proposition, knowing that your life might depend on it. This deliberate mockery extended beyond the political realm. Caligula reportedly dressed Incitatus in purple, the imperial colour, and often brought the horse into the dining hall during banquets, commanding guests to rise in respect. You can almost feel the stifling awkwardness, the desire to laugh hysterically mixed with the paralysing fear of doing so. This was not just a joke, it was a power play, a way to show his subjects that he controlled not just their lives, but their very sense of dignity and decorum. The story of Incitatus, while perhaps embellished over time, captures the essence of Caligula's rule, a terrifying blend of absolute power, capricious cruelty, and a profound, almost childlike desire to shock and provoke. It stands as a powerful testament to how far a ruler can descend into madness when unchecked, and how profoundly that madness can impact every aspect of an empire, even its most cherished institutions. The horse as consul is not just a footnote in history. It is a chilling symbol of a tyrant who saw his people, even his most esteemed subjects, as nothing more than toys for his amusement. As Caligula systematically dismantles the political and social structures of Rome, you are now forced to confront the dark and pervasive reality of his sexual exploitation. This isn't simply a matter of typical imperial promiscuity, which, while often frowned upon, was a common enough vice among Roman emperors. Caligula's sexual habits are marked by a unique blend of pathological lust, extreme perversion, and a chilling use of sex as another tool of degradation and control. He transforms the imperial palace into a stage for his rampant and often violent sexual escapades, leaving a trail of shattered lives and defiled reputations. You learn, through whispered rumours and terrified observations, of his insatiable appetite. He reportedly engaged in sexual acts with a vast array of individuals, indiscriminately choosing men, women, and even, as some ancient sources suggest, his own sisters, as we've already touched upon with Drusilla. His tastes are not merely unconventional, but overtly perverse, often involving public displays and forced participation. This isn't just about satisfying desire, it's about shocking, humiliating, and asserting absolute dominion over the bodies and wills of others. One particularly horrifying aspect is his treatment of aristocratic Roman women. He would often invite prominent senators and their wives to lavish banquets, only to, in the midst of the festivities, openly ogle and comment on the women present. You might witness him pointing to a senator's wife, a woman of high standing and virtue, and announcing to her husband in a casual, chilling tone that he intended to take her for his pleasure. The husband, bound by fear and the desperate need to survive, would be forced to feign acceptance, perhaps even offering his wife to the emperor. Imagine the sheer terror and humiliation of that moment, the complete violation of personal dignity and marital sanctity. After these forced encounters, Caligula would often return the women to their husbands, offering a public critique of their performance or their physical attributes, sometimes even giving them a receipt for the service rendered. This wasn't a clandestine affair. It was a deliberate act of public shaming, designed to break the spirits of the most powerful families in Rome. The women themselves would return utterly disgraced, their reputations ruined, their lives irrevocably scarred. You feel the profound injustice of it, the horrifying realization that personal honour, once so vital in Roman society, meant absolutely nothing under his rule. His sexual exploitation extended to the lowest echelons of society as well. He reportedly opened a lavish brothel within the imperial palace itself, filling it with respectable Roman citizens, men and women from good families, who were forced into prostitution. This wasn't for profit, as he had plenty of money. It was a further act of degradation, a way to show that no one was safe, that every Roman, regardless of status, was his personal property to use and abuse as he saw fit. He even had a register of all the prostitutes and their earnings, which he would then use to levy a special tax on them, further blurring the lines between private vice and public policy. Historians still debate the veracity of some of the more extreme claims of his sexual depravities, as ancient biographers often sensationalize such details. However, the consistent theme across multiple sources points to an emperor whose sexual conduct was unequivocally predatory, coercive, and profoundly disturbing, far exceeding the norms of even debauched Roman society. Was it a form of hypersexuality, a symptom of his mental illness? Or was it a deliberate weapon, a calculated strategy to destabilize his enemies and assert his absolute power by stripping them of their most cherished possessions, their honour and their family's virtue? One quirky yet chilling detail is his obsession with the idea of being Jupiter in mortal form. You might hear stories of him mimicking Jupiter's mythical sexual conquests, believing himself entitled to any woman he desired just as Jupiter did. He would reportedly invite couples to dinner, then order the husband to leave so he could have sex with the wife, proclaiming that he was doing so in the guise of Jupiter. It's a grotesque fusion of his divine delusions and his sexual predation, making his acts of violation seem almost sacred in his own twisted mind. You feel a profound sense of helplessness watching these events unfold. The atmosphere in the palace is thick with fear and suspicion. Courtiers constantly worry about who will be his next victim, who will be forced to endure public humiliation or private defilement. The women of Rome, especially those of high birth, live in perpetual dread, knowing that a single glance from the emperor could seal their fate. Their beauty, their status, which might normally offer protection, instead become dangerous liabilities. The Roman concept of pudicitia, female modesty and chastity, was deeply ingrained in their societal values. Caligula systematically attacked this cornerstone of Roman morality, leaving a permanent stain on the families he targeted. The long-term psychological impact on those who endured his sexual assaults and on the broader society that witnessed them must have been immense. It eroded trust, fostered paranoia, and destroyed the sense of security that citizens relied on, even under authoritarian rule. The constant tension surrounding his sexual appetite contributes significantly to the growing discontent among the elite, fueling the desire for his removal. While his public outrages were horrifying, it was often the deeply personal and humiliating violations, particularly those involving their wives and daughters, that pushed men of power to the breaking point. The fear of death, while present, was often less potent than the fear of enduring such profound dishonour. As you mentally navigate the gilded yet utterly corrupted halls of Caligula's palace, you realise that his sexual habits were not merely personal vices, they were an integral part of his system of terror. They were designed to atomise society, to break down familial bonds, and to leave individuals isolated and defenceless against his absolute will. The silence that often followed these acts of abuse was not consent, but the sound of profound, paralysing fear. Having delved into the disturbing realm of Caligula's sexual exploitation, you now confront an even broader and more pervasive aspect of his rule: his sheer enjoyment of cruelty as a form of entertainment. This isn't just about the occasional act of violence or the enforcement of laws, it's about a man who finds profound, almost artistic satisfaction in orchestrating suffering, transforming human misery into a public spectacle. The palace is no longer just a place of governance or debauchery, it's a theatre of torment, and you, the unwitting observer, are forced to witness its grim productions. You recall the gladiatorial games where he revelled in arbitrary death, but his cruelty extends far beyond the arena. It permeates every aspect of his interaction, every decision, every casual remark. He seems to possess an insatiable need to see others suffer, not out of any logical motivation, but for the sheer visceral thrill it provides him. This is not about justice, or even revenge. It's about power made manifest through pain. Consider his dinner parties, once symbols of Roman hospitality and status. Under Caligula, they become potential traps, stages for his sadistic whims. You might be a guest at one such banquet, trying desperately to maintain a polite, neutral expression, as Caligula points to a slave, or even a guest, and casually orders their torture or execution. He might then demand that the act be carried out in front of the assembled company, forcing everyone to watch the gruesome spectacle while feigning a sophisticated indifference. Imagine the psychological toll of such an evening, trying to enjoy a meal while someone is screaming in agony just feet away, knowing that your own life hangs by the thin thread of the emperor's volatile mood. One particularly horrifying story, widely recounted by ancient historians, speaks of Caligula's desire for novelty in his cruelties. He grew bored with quick executions. He would reportedly order victims to be tortured slowly, over extended periods, so that they might feel themselves dying. He supposedly coined the phrase ita feriutse morissentia, strike him so that he may feel himself dying. This wasn't just a casual remark, it was a directive for maximised suffering, a chilling insight into a mind that sought to prolong and intensify the agony of its victims. This kind of nuanced cruelty, focusing on the experience of dying, reveals a deeply disturbed psyche that found intellectual as well as emotional satisfaction in the infliction of pain. Historians still argue whether some of the most extreme accounts of Caligula's cruelty were literal or hyperbolic. Did he truly engage in every single act of torture and murder attributed to him? Or were some details embellished to paint an even darker picture by later hostile sources? While the precise details might be subject to scholarly debate, the overall consensus remains. Caligula was a uniquely cruel ruler who delighted in the suffering of others, far beyond the typical brutal realities of Roman power. His pleasure was undeniably derived from the act of inflicting pain, rather than merely from the removal of threats. You witness his casual disregard for human life. People are executed for the flimsiest of reasons, a sarcastic remark, a perceived slight, or simply because Caligula needs funds and confiscating their property requires their death. He often executed people at random, purely to instill fear and to remind everyone of his absolute power. "Let them hate me, so long as they fear me," he famously declared, echoing a sentiment often attributed to his predecessor Tiberius, but taken to an entirely new, terrifying extreme. This wasn't a strategic terror, it was terror for terror's sake. A quirky yet chilling example of his cruel humour is his habit of holding public auctions where he would sell off the property of executed citizens. He would often mock the deceased, making crude jokes about their lives or possessions, delighting in the forced laughter of the attendees. This wasn't just about seizing wealth, it was about posthumous humiliation, extending his cruelty even beyond the grave, further demonstrating that neither life nor death offered an escape from his reach. You'd probably think, wow, he really takes estate sale to a whole new macabre level. His cruelty extended even to animals. While gladiatorial games involved animal hunts, Caligula reportedly ordered the wanton slaughter of exotic animals imported at vast expense, simply for the spectacle of their demise, or to feed to his own pet lions, which he kept in the palace and reportedly fed with human victims. You hear whispers of unfortunate prisoners, or even courtiers who had fallen out of favour, being thrown into the lion pit, providing a gruesome meal for the emperor's savage pets. This wasn't about resource management, it was about the thrill of ending life, human or animal, for his own perverse pleasure. The constant threat of torture and death creates an atmosphere of pervasive paranoia throughout Rome. You see people going about their daily lives with an underlying tension, speaking in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact with strangers, and constantly looking over their shoulders. Trust evaporates. Neighbours betray neighbours to avoid suspicion, and even close family members are wary of each other, knowing that a careless word could lead to fatal consequences. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from earlier? Well, at this point you'd probably be more worried about being used as lion bait than about a skin rash. The sheer irrationality of his cruelty means that no one is truly safe, no matter their status or loyalty. It's a terrifying lesson in the abuse of absolute power, demonstrating how a single individual, untethered by morality or reason, can plunge an entire society into a state of perpetual fear and suffering. The mainstream historical fact about Roman emperors using public executions to maintain order or to demonstrate justice is perverted by Caligula. For him, these acts are not about order, but about chaos, not about justice, but about arbitrary, limitless power. The screams of his victims, whether in the arena, at a banquet, or in the palace dungeons, become a chilling soundtrack to his reign, a constant reminder of the monster on the throne. Having witnessed the sheer delight Caligula derived from cruelty, you now observe a specific, often insidious manifestation of his sadism, his systematic use of public humiliation as a weapon. This wasn't merely a byproduct of his volatile temper, it was a deliberate strategy to break the spirit of individuals and assert his dominance, often in the most bizarre and degrading ways. He understood that while physical pain could be endured, the destruction of one's public face, one's dignitas, could be a fate worse than death for a proud Roman. You recall his treatment of senators, forcing them to run alongside his chariot or serve him at banquets. But his methods of public humiliation extend far beyond these formal settings, spilling into everyday interactions and taking on a perverse, theatrical quality. Imagine being a prominent citizen, perhaps a military hero or a respected jurist, and suddenly finding yourself the target of the emperor's bizarre whims. One common tactic was to summon individuals to the palace under false pretenses, only to subject them to a barrage of insults or ridiculous demands. He might force someone to wear an absurd costume, or to perform a demeaning dance, or to sing off-key, all for the amusement of his court. you'd witness the forced smiles of the audience, terrified to laugh too loudly or not enough, as the victim endured their ordeal. The victim themselves would be caught between the profound shame of their situation and the desperate need to comply to avoid more severe punishment. A particularly chilling example of his public humiliation was his treatment of individuals who had made vows for his recovery during his illness. You remember those fervent prayers, those desperate promises made by citizens to sacrifice their own lives if Caligula would only recover. Well, Caligula had a remarkably long memory for such vows. Once he was well, he began to systematically force these individuals to fulfill their promises. You might hear of a man who vowed to fight as a gladiator for the emperor's recovery now being dragged into the arena, forced to fight, knowing that his family's honour and his own life depended on this grotesque fulfilment of a desperate prayer. Or a father who vowed to sacrifice his children, now forced to face that unthinkable choice. It was a macabre joke, transforming piety into a death sentence, all for Caligula's amusement. This isn't just about punishment, it's about twisting the very concept of devotion into a tool of terror. Historians still argue about the precise number of people who were forced to fulfill such vows. While the scale might be debated, the principle of it is undeniable. Caligula used deeply personal commitments as a means to inflict maximum psychological torment and public disgrace. Was it a legalistic interpretation of vows, or just another excuse for cruelty? Regardless, it showcased his relentless desire to control not just actions, but the very intentions and desperate hopes of his subjects. He delighted in creating situations where people were forced to debase themselves. For instance, he might invite guests to a banquet and then, without warning, empty a chamber pot over their heads, or shower them with torrents of water from hidden pipes. The guests, covered in filth, would be forced to pretend it was a hilarious prank, even while their clothes were ruined and their dignity shattered. It was a bizarre, almost childish form of bullying, but with lethal consequences for anyone who failed to play along. You would feel the sudden cold shock, the humiliation, and then the frantic internal scramble to suppress any sign of anger or disgust. One quirky tidbit involves his frequent use of bizarre, impromptu theatrical performances. He would force distinguished senators or members of his court to perform humiliating roles in plays, often involving grotesque costumes or crude sexual acts, all for his personal amusement. These weren't professional actors. They were powerful individuals forced into roles that utterly destroyed their public image. Imagine a venerable old general being forced to prance around in a flimsy costume, making a fool of himself, while the emperor roared with laughter. It was a perverse subversion of the traditional Roman ideal of public service and honourable conduct. His public humiliations often served a dual purpose, not only to break the individual victim but also to send a chilling message to anyone observing. If he could do this to them, people of such high standing, what could he not do to you? This systematic degradation chipped away at the collective morale of Rome, fostering an environment of pervasive anxiety and self-censorship. People became terrified of standing out, of drawing any attention to themselves, even positive attention, for fear of becoming his next target. The mainstream historical fact that Roman society placed immense value on reputation and public honour makes Caligula's actions particularly devastating. For a Roman, losing face, being publicly ridiculed, or having one's family dishonoured could be more painful than physical torture. Caligula instinctively understood this, and he exploited it with a chilling precision. He wasn't just killing bodies, he was killing souls, systematically stripping away the very essence of what it meant to be a respected Roman citizen. The atmosphere in Rome becomes one of suffocating politeness and pervasive fear. Every gesture, every word, every facial expression is carefully calibrated to avoid offence. You find yourself practicing a neutral, bland expression in mirrors, trying to erase any hint of personality that might draw his attention. The vibrancy and boldness that once characterised Roman public life slowly drain away, replaced by a cautious, timid deference. The city itself feels quieter, as if everyone is holding their breath. The sense of constant dread hangs heavy in the air, a persistent hum that underscores every interaction. You begin to understand that survival under Caligula's rule isn't about strength, but about an almost pathological ability to become invisible. As Caligula revels in public humiliation and displays of gratuitous cruelty, a more insidious and far-reaching consequence of his misrule begins to take hold of Rome. the ominous shadow of famine and economic crisis. This isn't merely a result of bad luck or poor harvests. It's a direct outcome of his reckless spending, his irrational building projects, and his utter disregard for sound economic management. You now witness the chilling impact of a mad emperor's whims on the very sustenance of his people. Rome, as you know, was heavily reliant on imported grain, primarily from Egypt and North Africa, to feed its massive population. The continuity of this supply was paramount to social stability. Any disruption could lead to widespread unrest, even riots. Caligula, however, seems oblivious to this fundamental reality, or perhaps he simply doesn't care. His vast personal expenditures, exemplified by the Bay of Naples bridge constructed from commandeered merchant ships, systematically drain the imperial coffers and disrupt vital trade routes. Imagine the scene in the Roman granaries. They are usually bustling, filled with sacks of wheat, a reassuring sight for the city's inhabitants. But now you see them dwindling, their shelves increasingly bare. The usual shipments of grain from Egypt are delayed, or arrive in insufficient quantities, because the ships that transport them have been diverted for the emperor's absurd spectacles, or are simply not available due to the disruption of trade. The port of Ostia, usually a hive of activity, becomes quieter, less vibrant, as fewer ships make their way to Roman shores. The price of bread, the staple of the Roman diet, begins to skyrocket. What was once affordable for the common labourer now becomes a luxury. You see the desperation in the eyes of ordinary citizens as they queue at bakeries, only to be turned away, or to find prices beyond their reach. The whispers of hunger turn into grumbles, then into murmurs of genuine fear and anger. People who had once cheered Caligula's ascension now curse his name under their breath. Historians still argue about the precise severity of the famine during Caligula's reign. Was it a full-blown, widespread starvation, or a period of acute food shortages and escalating prices that caused immense hardship, particularly for the urban poor? While the extent may be debated, the evidence consistently points to a significant period of economic distress and food scarcity directly attributable to his policies. His inability or unwillingness to manage the empire's resources prudently led directly to the suffering of his own people. Beyond the diversion of ships, Caligula's fiscal policies are nothing short of disastrous. His initial burst of generosity, the large donations to the Praetorian Guard and the populace, quickly empties the treasury. To replenish it, he resorts to increasingly desperate and cruel measures. You remember the bizarre and insulting taxes he imposed, taxes on lawsuits, on prostitution, even a tax on public latrines. These are not only economically burdensome, but profoundly humiliating, a clear sign that the emperor is squeezing every last denarius from his subjects. He also resorts to confiscation of private property on a massive scale. Accusations of treason, however flimsy, become commonplace, not out of any genuine threat to his rule, but simply as a pretext to seize the wealth of prominent citizens. You hear tales of wealthy families suddenly being stripped of their estates, their assets liquidated, their homes seized, all for the emperor's personal enrichment. This isn't just about revenue, it's about eliminating potential rivals and consolidating wealth into his own hands, further destabilizing the economy and fostering an intense climate of fear. No one's property, no one's inheritance, is safe. One quirky tidbit, perhaps a darkly humorous illustration of his financial recklessness, is the story of him reportedly dissolving precious pearls in vinegar and drinking them at banquets, solely to demonstrate his boundless wealth. While likely exaggerated, it perfectly captures the image of an emperor who viewed resources not as a tool for governance, but as raw material for extravagant, meaningless displays of power, utterly detached from the suffering of his subjects. You might think, well, that's certainly one way to get your daily calcium, but a bit pricey for a multivitamin. The Roman state, under normal circumstances, had robust financial mechanisms. Public works, legions, and the grain supply were all meticulously managed. But under Caligula, this system unravels. His capriciousness means that long-term planning is impossible. Funds are diverted on a whim, resources are squandered, and the focus is always on immediate gratification rather than sustainable governance. The sheer unpredictability of his demands makes effective administration impossible. You feel the gnawing anxiety of scarcity in the city. The bustling markets become hushed, as fewer goods are available and fewer people can afford them. The cries of children begging for food become more frequent. The initial joyous parades and games are now overshadowed by the grim reality of daily struggle. The people's love for their little boot has turned to bitter resentment, a dangerous sentiment for an emperor who relies on their acquiescence. The famine and economic distress created by Caligula's policies serve as a powerful catalyst for the growing discontent among all strata of Roman society. The common people, suffering from hunger, see their emperor indulging in unimaginable luxury. The elite, besides being humiliated, see their wealth confiscated and their economic stability threatened. This widespread misery and resentment begin to coalesce, forming a dangerous undercurrent that will eventually erupt. The image of the glittering palace, filled with its debauched revelry, stands in stark contrast to the hungry faces in the streets, a testament to a ruler who was utterly divorced from the realities of his empire. As Rome grapples with the economic fallout of Caligula's recklessness and the pervasive fear he instills, you now witness the alarming escalation of his megalomania, pushing his delusions of grandeur to truly unprecedented and absurd extremes. This isn't just about believing he's a god, it's about a complete break from reality, where his every whim, no matter how impossible or ridiculous, becomes an imperial decree, often with fatal consequences for those who fail to deliver. You recall his earlier claims of divinity, his arguments with Jupiter. But now these delusions become even more entrenched and fantastical. He no longer merely claims to be a god, he attempts to behave as one, demanding feats that defy natural law and human capability. He constantly seeks to outdo every previous emperor, every historical figure, in terms of sheer scale and audacity. His mind seems to be a churning vortex of grand, impossible schemes. Consider his plan for an invasion of Britain. This wasn't a well-thought-out military campaign. It was a bizarre, almost comical charade driven by pure ego. You might hear the legions mustered, immense preparations made, only for Caligula to lead them to the northern coast of Gaul near the English Channel. Instead of commanding them to cross, he orders them to stop, face the sea, and gather seashells. Yes, seashells. He declared these shells to be the spoils of the ocean, a triumph over Neptune himself. Imagine the utter bewilderment and humiliation of battle-hardened Roman legionaries, dressed in their armour, digging for clams on a beach, all while their emperor watched, presumably delighted by his own perverse humour. Historians still argue about the true motivation behind this bizarre invasion. Was it a deliberate mockery of military glory? A desperate attempt to stage a fake victory after abandoning a real campaign? Or was it simply a manifestation of his deranged mind, seeing divine significance in collecting shells? Whatever the exact reason, it showcased his profound detachment from military strategy and the brutal reality of warfare. It was a spectacle of absurdity, utterly wasteful of military resources and deeply demoralizing for the troops. His megalomania also manifests in increasingly theatrical demands for public adulation. He craves constant praise, but not merely polite applause. He demands exaggerated, almost grotesque displays of devotion. You might be forced to cheer him with specific preordained chants, or to fall prostrate before him as he passes, even if you are a senator of advanced age. He would observe closely, and any lack of enthusiasm, any hint of insincerity, could lead to severe repercussions. The atmosphere around him becomes charged with an unnatural intensity, a forced performance of worship that is utterly draining. One quirky tidbit about his self-aggrandizement is his insistence on being referred to by increasingly elaborate and ludicrous titles. He went beyond princeps or Augustus. He demanded to be called Optimus Maximus, best and greatest, an epithet usually reserved for Jupiter himself. He even considered adopting the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, a term that would later become standard for Roman emperors, but was at this time considered blasphemous and indicative of Eastern despotism. You might find yourself whispering these titles, feeling the absurdity of them on your tongue, even as you bow your head in deference. He constructs a massive bridge across the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, not for practical purposes, but solely to connect his palace directly to the Temple of Jupiter, symbolically asserting his personal connection and superiority to the chief Roman deity. You see the immense expenditure of resources on such projects, designed purely to feed his ego, while the city below struggles with food shortages and discontent. This wasn't about improving Rome, it was about elevating Caligula above Rome, above humanity, above even the gods. His demands for luxury also reached new heights of excess. He reportedly ordered that his food be sprinkled with gold leaf, not for taste, but for the sheer opulence. His clothes are constantly changed, each more lavish than the last. He organises banquets that last for days, where food is often wasted in vast quantities, thrown into the sea or given to animals, simply to demonstrate his limitless wealth and contempt for scarcity. You remember the rising food prices in the city, the hungry faces. This blatant waste, flaunted so openly, only deepens the public's resentment. Historians still debate the precise diagnosis for Caligula's mental state. Was it a form of epilepsy affecting his temporal lobe, leading to personality changes and delusions? Was it schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, exacerbated by the immense power he wielded? Or perhaps a simple, unfettered sociopathy combined with childhood trauma? The symptoms certainly align with several severe psychological conditions, but the exact nature of his madness remains an open scholarly debate. What is clear is that his mind operated on a level far removed from conventional reality, driven by internal demons that manifested as external tyranny. The impact of his megalomania on the Roman administration is devastating. No one dares to question his outlandish demands. Advisors who offer sensible counsel are dismissed or executed. The most competent administrators are replaced by sycophants who will agree to anything. Decisions are made not based on logic or necessity, but on the whim of a delusional emperor, leading to chaotic governance and a continuous drain on the empire's resources. As you stand amidst the crumbling grandeur of Caligula's Rome, you feel the profound disconnect between the emperor's fantastical world and the harsh realities faced by its citizens. His demands grow ever more impossible, his delusions ever more entrenched, and the empire itself seems to groan under the weight of his increasingly boundless, terrifying self-belief. It's a sobering realization that sometimes the greatest danger to a state comes not from external enemies, but from the unhinged mind of its own ruler. Having witnessed Caligula's escalating megalomania and its devastating impact on Rome's economy, your senses are now assaulted by the sheer, unbridled excess of his feasts and banquets. These gatherings are not merely social events or political functions, they are grotesque spectacles of gluttony, waste, and perverse entertainment, designed to flaunt his boundless wealth and to further humiliate those forced to attend. Imagine the most opulent dinner party you can conceive, then amplify it 1,000-fold, infuse it with a chilling undercurrent of fear, and strip it of all genuine enjoyment. You step into the imperial dining hall, a vast chamber decorated with gold, marble, and intricate mosaics. The air is heavy with the scent of exotic spices, roasted meats, and expensive perfumes, mingling strangely with the underlying tension. Tables groan under the weight of an unimaginable array of dishes, rare birds from distant lands, exotic seafood brought from across the Mediterranean, and mountains of delicacies. There are elaborate desserts shaped like mythical creatures, and wine flows endlessly from golden amphorae. The sheer volume of food is staggering, far more than any number of guests could possibly consume. But the extravagance isn't for pleasure alone, it's a deliberate act of waste. You might see Caligula casually ordering entire platters of untouched food to be thrown into the sea, or fed to his wild animals while the city outside grapples with food shortages. This isn't just a sign of wealth, it's a profound act of contempt for the very concept of scarcity, a chilling reminder of his detachment from the suffering of his subjects. He laughs, a harsh, unfeeling sound, as servants dutifully carry out his wasteful commands. His banquets often feature bizarre and cruel entertainment. You might witness him forcing prominent senators or their wives to perform degrading acts as discussed earlier. He might compel guests to engage in grotesque eating contests, or to drink until they vomit, delighting in their discomfort and loss of control. The line between guest and performer, between participant and victim, is constantly blurred. You feel a knot in your stomach, constantly alert, trying to anticipate his next unpredictable command, desperate to avoid becoming the focus of his cruel amusement. One particularly infamous habit was his practice of bringing his favourite horse, Incitatus, into the dining hall. Imagine the scene. This magnificent animal, adorned in imperial purple and jewels, is paraded through the room, its presence serving as a constant, silent insult to the assembled human guests. Caligula would reportedly command that Incitatus be given the finest food and drink, often from golden vessels, while ignoring or openly mocking his human courtiers. It's a powerful symbol of his contempt, a deliberate act of subversion of the social hierarchy, designed to demonstrate that a horse, in his estimation, held more dignity than many of Rome's leading men. Historians still argue whether the most extreme accounts of his banquets, such as the drinking of dissolved pearls or the feeding of human flesh to his lions at the dinner table, were entirely literal or exaggerated for dramatic effect by later writers. However, the consistent portrayal across multiple ancient sources paints a picture of lavishness, pushed to the point of grotesque excess and cruelty. The consensus is that his feasts were indeed arenas for his most depraved and humiliating behaviours, a stage for his tyranny. You might also observe the peculiar atmosphere of forced merriment. Laughter, when it occurs, is often strained, brittle, and always accompanied by a quick glance at the emperor to ensure it's the right kind of laughter. Any genuine mirth is quickly stifled by the pervasive fear. Guests are not there to enjoy themselves, they are there to perform, to flatter, and to survive. The conversation is often stilted, punctuated by nervous silences, as everyone tries to avoid saying anything that might displease the emperor. A quirky detail that reveals his peculiar approach to luxury is his apparent penchant for bathing in expensive perfumes and consuming immense quantities of rare and costly delicacies, not for their taste, but simply because they were expensive. He would reportedly spend the equivalent of vast fortunes on single meals, purely for the ephemeral pleasure of destroying wealth. You might think, well, that's one way to waste money, but at least it smells nice for a bit. The sheer financial drain of these banquets is immense. They are not merely occasional indulgences, but frequent occurrences, contributing significantly to the depletion of the imperial treasury, already strained by his other follies. The resources consumed, the time wasted, the disruption to normal court functions, all serve to further destabilise the administration and hasten Rome's economic decline. The empire is, quite literally, being eaten away by its emperor's insatiable appetites. The contrast between the extreme luxury within the palace and the growing hardship outside its walls is stark and deeply unsettling. While Caligula gorges himself on rare delicacies and bathes in perfumes, ordinary Roman citizens queue for dwindling supplies of basic foodstuffs, their hunger gnawing at their stomachs. This glaring disparity fuels popular resentment and cements his image as a detached, self-serving tyrant. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Well, at one of Caligula's banquets, you'd probably rather be smeared with it than risk catching his eye and becoming the next subject of his perverse entertainment. The fear of being singled out, of being subjected to his arbitrary humiliations or forced into a degrading act, makes these feasts a living hell for many attendees. These opulent yet terrifying feasts serve as a microcosm of Caligula's entire reign, a chaotic blend of unparalleled luxury, profound cruelty, and an utter disregard for the well-being of anyone but himself. They are a chilling testament to the corrupting influence of absolute power, demonstrating how a man's personal vices can be magnified into widespread societal suffering when unchecked by reason, morality, or any form of accountability. The ringing laughter you hear in the dining hall isn't joy. It's the chilling sound of madness consuming an empire. As Caligula's reign spirals into ever-increasing depravity, fueled by his megalomania, wanton cruelty, and insatiable appetite for destruction, you begin to perceive a subtle but significant shift within his immediate circle. The growing unease among the Praetorian Guard. This elite corps, the emperor's personal bodyguards and the most powerful military unit in Rome, holds the ultimate key to imperial power. Their loyalty is paramount, and without it, no emperor, no matter how absolute, can long survive. You now witness the cracks forming in this crucial foundation. The Praetorian Guard, as you know, were not just soldiers. They were highly paid, privileged, and often deeply influential. They lived in Rome, close to the emperor, and their commander, the Praetorian prefect, was one of the most powerful men in the empire. They were instrumental in making and unmaking emperors. Their initial loyalty to Caligula was secured through generous donatives and the promise of stability after the unpopular Tiberius. You remember those early lavish payments, the widespread joy among the guardsmen at their new, seemingly benevolent ruler. However, Caligula's increasingly erratic behaviour begins to erode this loyalty. The guardsmen are direct witnesses to his daily outrages. They see his public humiliations of senators, his casual cruelty towards slaves and courtiers, his bizarre self-deification, and his boundless extravagance that threatens to bankrupt the state. While soldiers are accustomed to brutality, Caligula's cruelty often lacks military logic or justifiable cause, making it disturbing even to hardened veterans. It's one thing to execute a traitor, it's another to torture someone for sport or to force a senator to run beside your chariot. You might hear whispers among the ranks, hushed conversations in the barracks. The guardsmen are not immune to the widespread fear gripping Rome. They have families, and they too are affected by the rising food prices and the general instability. Their sense of professional pride, their disciplina, is also challenged by Caligula's bizarre demands. Imagine their reaction when he leads them on that absurd campaign to collect seashells in Gaul. It's an affront to their military honour, a ludicrous waste of their training and purpose. They are soldiers, not beachcombers. One significant factor contributing to their unease is Caligula's capricious appointments and dismissals within their own ranks. He would elevate favourite officers on a whim, only to cast them down in disgrace or execute them without warning. This creates an atmosphere of intense paranoia and distrust, even within the Praetorian Guard itself. No one feels safe, no matter how close they are to the emperor. You see ambitious officers constantly vying for favour, but also constantly fearing the emperor's fickle nature. Historians still argue about the precise moment or incident that truly turned the Praetorian Guard against Caligula. Was it a specific act of cruelty against one of their own, the public mockery of their profession, the chronic financial instability that threatened their pay and perks? Or was it a cumulative effect of all his abuses? What is clear is that a growing number of influential officers and individuals within the Guard began to view Caligula not as their leader, but as a dangerous liability, a madman whose continued rule threatened the very stability of the empire they were sworn to protect. A quirky, yet chilling detail that highlights the Praetorian Guard's predicament is Caligula's supposed practice of walking through their barracks at night, alone and without his usual retinue, whispering threats to the sleeping soldiers. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? You think, a fleeting moment of levity in a sea of dread. But this detail highlights his constant psychological warfare, even against his own protectors. It was a bizarre form of intimidation, designed to ensure that even in their sleep, they were aware of his presence and his power. It's a testament to his paranoia, but also to his profound belief that he could control even their subconscious fears. The commander of the Praetorian Guard at this time, Cassius Chaerea, plays a pivotal role. He is an experienced tribune, a brave and respected officer who fought honourably in Germanicus's campaigns. Germanicus, you recall, was Caligula's revered father. Chaerea is also a man of delicate features and a soft voice, which Caligula constantly mocks, calling him effeminate and taunting him with lewd jokes. This personal humiliation, inflicted repeatedly and publicly by the emperor he is sworn to protect, becomes a burning catalyst for Chaerea's resentment. For a Roman officer, such mockery was a profound indignity, a systematic attempt to strip him of his masculinity and honour. The mainstream historical fact is that the Praetorian Guard, while serving the emperor, also had a vested interest in the stability of the imperial system. A mad emperor who threatened the very foundations of the state was not in their long-term interest. They sought order, reliable pay, and a secure future. Caligula's recklessness jeopardized all of these. They also had a practical monopoly on force within Rome. If they collectively decided an emperor had to go, he usually went. As you observe the growing dissent within the Praetorian Guard, you sense the turning of the tide. The murmurs become more frequent, the glances more significant. Officers, frustrated by their humiliation and increasingly concerned for their own safety and the stability of the empire, begin to explore options. The question is no longer if Caligula will be removed, but when and by whom. The very men who were sworn to protect him are now eyeing him with a dangerous glint, not of loyalty, but of calculating resolve. The stage is set for a dramatic and violent end to this reign of madness. The unease simmering within the Praetorian Guard, coupled with the widespread suffering and humiliation across Roman society, now coalesces into something far more dangerous, a series of increasingly elaborate and desperate assassination plots. You feel the palpable tension in the air, the frantic energy of men pushed to their breaking point, their lives and the stability of the empire hanging by the thinnest thread. The question is no longer if Caligula will fall, but which conspiracy, out of the many bubbling beneath the surface, will finally succeed. You recall the immense power of the Praetorian Guard. For an assassination plot to succeed, their involvement is crucial. Isolated attempts by disgruntled senators or private citizens are almost certainly doomed to fail. But now, key figures within the Guard, men like Cassius Chaerea, the tribune whom Caligula so cruelly mocked, are actively involved in orchestrating his downfall. Chaerea, whose effeminate voice and delicate features were constant targets of the emperor's vile jokes, nurses a deep, burning resentment. For a military man, such public degradation was intolerable, a profound stain on his honour that only Caligula's death could erase. The conspiracy you focus on is not a singular, unified plot, but a confluence of desperate individuals and factions. Senators, fed up with their systematic humiliation and the constant threat to their lives and families, secretly meet in hushed tones, their faces etched with fear and determination. Wealthy equities, their fortunes depleted by Caligula's rapacious taxes and arbitrary confiscations, also join the growing ranks of the disaffected. Even members of the imperial household, perhaps fearing for their own safety, or simply horrified by the emperor's depravity, begin to lend their support. These meetings are fraught with peril. Discovery means not just death, but prolonged torture and the obliteration of their families. You imagine the coded language, the furtive glances, the constant paranoia as they try to ascertain who can be trusted. Every new recruit brings the risk of betrayal. Every whispered plan carries the potential for catastrophic failure. The conspirators know that Caligula, despite his madness, is also paranoid and has a network of spies. He has already executed many who he suspected of disloyalty, often on the flimsiest of evidence. The initial attempts are often tentative, small-scale, and easily foiled. You might hear whispers of poisoned food, or a rigged chariot, or a lone attacker being swiftly apprehended. These failures only heighten the tension, making future attempts even more difficult and dangerous. But each failure also solidifies the resolve of the remaining conspirators, proving that bolder, more coordinated action is necessary. Historians still argue about the exact sequence of events and the precise number of plots against Caligula. Some sources suggest there were several overlapping conspiracies, while others focus on the successful one, emphasizing the role of Chaerea and other Praetorian officers. What is undeniable is the pervasive atmosphere of conspiracy and the widespread desire for the emperor's demise that permeated Roman society during the latter years of his reign. His rule was so universally hated that it generated a desperate consensus that he had to be removed. A quirky detail, illustrating the madness of the times, is that Caligula himself seemed to have an almost supernatural awareness of plots against him, often executing people he simply felt were disloyal, even without concrete evidence. Yet, his sheer arrogance and belief in his own invincibility prevented him from truly protecting himself from the most serious threats. He had dismissed loyal bodyguards, mocked those who expressed concern for his safety, and surrounded himself with sycophants rather than competent protectors. His belief in his own divinity, remember, made him feel immune to mortal dangers. The conspirators face a significant challenge: how to approach a man who is always surrounded by armed guards, who rarely appears in public without a large retinue, and who trusts almost no one. They need an opportune moment, a time when he is vulnerable and isolated enough for a swift, decisive strike. They settle on the Palatine Games, a series of theatrical performances and spectacles held in January of 41 CE. Caligula, with his love for the stage, is almost certain to attend, and the nature of the event with its crowds and performers might offer the necessary distractions. Cassius Chaerea begins to actively recruit more officers, appealing to their sense of honour, their frustration with Caligula's mockery, and their fear for the empire's stability. He points to the economic ruin, the constant humiliation, the arbitrary executions, and the threat to the traditional Roman way of life. He emphasizes that Caligula is not just a cruel emperor, but a deranged one, whose continued rule threatens to bring down the entire system. You imagine him speaking in hushed, urgent tones, his usually soft voice gaining a surprising intensity as he outlines the necessity of their desperate act. The conspirators agree to strike on the last day of the Palatine Games. The plan is to intercept Caligula as he leaves the theatre, in a relatively narrow, quiet passage, before he reaches the open courtyard where his full Praetorian escort would be more heavily concentrated. It is a risky gamble, requiring perfect timing and coordination. The fate of Rome hangs in the balance, tied to the success or failure of these desperate, courageous men. The air feels thick with anticipation, the quiet hum of impending violence growing louder with each passing day. The stage is set. The Palatine Games are in full swing, and the oppressive atmosphere in Rome is thick with the unspoken dread of Caligula's continued rule, yet also buzzing with the clandestine anticipation of the conspirators. You feel the tension building, a crescendo of fear and desperate hope, as the moment of reckoning draws near. This is the day the plotting finally gives way to action, where the whispers turn into screams, and the tyrant finally meets his end. It is January 24th, 41 CE. The day is warm for winter, and Caligula has spent the morning at the theatre within the imperial palace complex overseeing the dramatic performances. His mood, as usual, is volatile. He has reportedly been in a particularly bad temper, making crude remarks, interrupting the show, and generally making everyone around him miserable. The conspirators, including Cassius Chaerea, the Praetorian Tribune, and Cornelius Sabinus, another tribune, are present, their hearts pounding beneath their tunics, their eyes constantly scanning for the opportune moment. The plan is to ambush him in a secluded corridor. Caligula, known for his eccentric habits, often chose unexpected routes and moments for his exits, making a precise ambush difficult. The conspirators have to adapt, seizing the opportunity as it arises. You see him now leaving the theatre after the performances have concluded, heading towards the palace baths or a private lunch. He is surrounded by his usual retinue of guards, courtiers, and even some actors and singers. It's a chaotic, noisy procession, but there's a narrow, dimly lit passage that he must traverse. Suddenly a disturbance erupts. Some sources suggest a group of boys from Asia are preparing to sing a hymn for him, providing a momentary distraction. Others claim a Praetorian guard creates a diversion, pushing forward to ask for a password. Whatever the exact trigger, the crucial moment of vulnerability arrives. Cassius Chaerea steps forward, seemingly to ask Caligula for a password. As Caligula gives a jocular, perhaps even demeaning response, Chaerea draws his sword. The blade flashes in the dim light. His first blow is aimed at Caligula's neck, a strike intended to be fatal, a direct response to the emperor's constant mockery of his strength and masculinity. You see the shock on Caligula's face, a flicker of disbelief as the blade connects. The emperor cries out, "I am still alive!" and attempts to flee. But the passage is narrow, and the other conspirators are now upon him. Cornelius Sabinus, perhaps spurred on by Chaerea's decisive action, also strikes. Others join in, a flurry of swords and daggers. The scene devolves into chaotic violence. The suddenness of the attack, the narrow confines of the corridor, and the sheer number of assailants prevent Caligula's immediate retinue, and the less involved guards from reacting effectively. You hear the screams, the clash of steel, the terrified shouts of the courtiers scattering in every direction. Caligula, despite his earlier arrogance and belief in his own divinity, fights back desperately, but he is overwhelmed. He falls to the ground, and the conspirators continue to stab him, a frenzy of blades, ensuring that there is no chance of survival. Some accounts say he received over 30 wounds, a testament to the collective hatred and fear he had inspired. The blows are not just to kill, but to utterly annihilate, to express the pent-up rage of years of tyranny. Historians still argue about the exact number of conspirators involved in the immediate attack, and the precise sequence of the blows. Some accounts highlight the methodical nature of Chaerea's attack, while others depict a more chaotic, spontaneous mob. What is certain is that the assassination was a direct and brutal act of regicide, carried out by those who had suffered most directly under his rule. It was not a distant, anonymous poisoning. It was a close-quarters, personal act of vengeance. A quirky yet grim detail emerges amidst the chaos. After Caligula falls, his German bodyguards, renowned for their fierce loyalty, rush to his aid. Mistaking other senators for the assassins in the confusion, they mistakenly kill innocent bystanders and even some of the Praetorian guards who were not involved in the conspiracy, further adding to the carnage. This brief bloody melee highlights the profound confusion and paranoia that Caligula's rule had instilled, where trust was non-existent and violence was always lurking just beneath the surface. You might recall the random executions, the arbitrary punishments. Now chaos reigns supreme. The death of Caligula, though violent and bloody, brings an immediate, palpable shift in the atmosphere. The heavy blanket of fear that had suffocated Rome for years seems to lift, if only momentarily. News spreads rapidly through the palace, then throughout the city like wildfire. There is a sense of disbelief, then cautious relief, quickly followed by a chaotic scramble for power. The mainstream historical fact of the matter is that Caligula's assassination was not a random act of violence, but the culmination of systematic oppression and degradation. His absolute power, unchecked by institutions or morality, had led directly to his own violent demise. His death served as a stark reminder of the inherent dangers of unchecked tyranny, a lesson that Rome and future empires would do well to remember. As the body of the emperor lies lifeless in the narrow corridor, soaked in blood, you see the conspirators quickly disperse, their mission accomplished. But the immediate aftermath is far from peaceful. The Praetorian Guard, now without a clear leader, is in disarray. The Senate, initially hesitant, begins to convene, contemplating a return to republican rule, a brief fleeting dream of freedom. But the machinery of empire, once set in motion, is difficult to stop. The legacy of Caligula's madness, however, would continue to echo through the halls of power, a chilling cautionary tale of the dark depths to which human nature, when combined with absolute power, can sink. The blood on the floor is not just his, it's a grim stain on the very soul of Rome. The immediate aftermath of Caligula's assassination is a whirlwind of chaos and uncertainty. The blood on the palace floor, the sudden silence where the mad emperor's voice once held sway, leaves a vacuum of power that Rome struggles to fill. You feel the tremor of seismic change ripple through the city, a mixture of profound relief and desperate apprehension. The long nightmare of Caligula's reign is over, but what new reality will dawn? News of the assassination spreads like wildfire. Initially there's disbelief, then cautious whispers, and finally, open, albeit nervous, celebration. In the forum, people tentatively emerge from their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and dawning hope. The oppressive atmosphere that had suffocated Rome for years begins to lift, replaced by a fragile, almost ethereal sense of liberation. You see people exchanging furtive glances, then small, tentative smiles, before daring to express their joy. The Praetorian Guard, whose hands are stained with the emperor's blood, are now in a precarious position. Some, like Cassius Chaerea and his co-conspirators, believe they have liberated Rome and restored its dignity. Others, particularly the loyal German guard who mistakenly attacked innocent bystanders, are consumed by a desire for vengeance for their fallen emperor. This internal conflict within the guard creates immediate instability. Amidst the confusion, the Senate, emboldened by Caligula's death, seizes the moment. You witness them convene, perhaps in the very curia where they had suffered so many indignities under the dead emperor. There's a renewed, fervent debate about the future of Rome. Many senators, weary of the imperial system and its inherent abuses, argue passionately for a return to the Republic. Imagine the eloquence, the historical arguments, the desperate yearning for the old ways of elected magistrates and senatorial governance. This is a fleeting dream, a desperate hope that Rome can truly shed the chains of imperial tyranny. However, this dream quickly collides with the harsh realities of power. The Praetorian Guard, despite their role in Caligula's demise, are not interested in restoring a republic that would diminish their own influence and prestige. They want an emperor, one they can control, one who will reward their loyalty. You see them scouring the palace, looking for a suitable candidate. In a bizarre twist of fate, they stumble upon Caligula's uncle, Claudius, cowering behind a curtain, terrified for his life. Claudius, known for his physical infirmities, his scholarly pursuits, and his seemingly innocuous nature, is seen as an ideal puppet ruler. He is easily manipulated, or so they believe. Historians still argue about the true extent of the Senate's support for a return to the Republic, and how close Rome came to truly abolishing the imperial system after Caligula. Was it a genuine, viable attempt, or merely a passionate but ultimately futile debate among a minority of idealists? While the desire was certainly present among some, the institutional power of the military, particularly the Praetorian Guard, proved to be too formidable to overcome. The mainstream historical fact is that the Republic, in its true form, was already long dead, and the imperial system, however flawed, was too entrenched to be dismantled by a mere assassination. A quirky detail that highlights the uncertainty of the moment is the initial confusion surrounding Caligula's body. Some accounts suggest his wife, Caesonia, and his young daughter, Julia Drusilla, were also murdered in the aftermath, though details vary. His body was reportedly carried away secretly and hastily cremated, his ashes later buried by his sisters when they returned from exile. Even in death, his presence was too toxic to be openly acknowledged, a testament to the hatred he had inspired. The ascension of Claudius marks a return to a semblance of order, though the scars of Caligula's reign run deep. The public humiliation, the economic turmoil, the pervasive fear, these are not easily forgotten. The Roman people, while relieved, are now profoundly cynical about their rulers. They have seen the terrifying depths to which absolute power can sink, and the fragility of even the most established institutions when confronted by a truly mad emperor. The legacy of Caligula's disgusting habits and his reign of terror would continue to haunt Rome for generations. He became the archetypal mad emperor, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones, a yardstick against which all future tyrants would be measured. His name became synonymous with cruelty, depravity, and irrationality. The very word Caligula conjures images of unbridled power gone utterly, catastrophically wrong. You might remember that crocodile dung sunscreen. Now, as Rome tentatively steps into a new era, people might find themselves wondering if any amount of protection, any amount of a bizarre antidote, could ever truly shield them from the next madness that might sit on the imperial throne. The empire had endured, but its soul was undeniably bruised, its faith in its leaders profoundly shaken. The end of Caligula's story is not a neat resolution, but a stark reminder of the corrosive nature of unchecked power and the human cost of mental illness combined with ultimate authority. His habits weren't just personal quirks, they were instruments of terror that reshaped Roman society, leaving a lasting scar. His death was a necessity, a violent excision of a cancerous growth, but it left the body of the empire weak and vulnerable to future ailments. As the sun sets over Rome, casting long shadows across the monuments that have witnessed so much, you can almost feel the city exhale, a collective sigh of relief. But beneath that relief lies a profound weariness, a knowledge that the seeds of madness, once sown, can lie dormant, waiting for the next opportunity to bloom into terror. The journey through Caligula's reign has been a disturbing one, a testament to the darkest corners of human nature,